Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm delighted to have all of you with us this evening. This is the last public lecture of Jewish Studies for this semester. And I want to thank all of you if you've attended those lectures with us before, either during the semester or even in previous, really 2.5 years since the COVID started. So I'm Chavat Yoror Samuelson. I'm the Director of Jewish Studies at ASU. I'm also Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and Regents Professor of History. Many of you have heard me say it more than once, but I do have to say something about Jewish Studies. So here at Jewish Studies, we offer undergraduate and graduate courses, as well as a robust program of public education, primarily now on Zoom, but not exclusively. In our academic instruction and in our public events, we cover all aspects of Jewish civilization, history, religion, and culture, and we do so from a variety of disciplinary perspectives, including history, sociology, religious studies, philosophy, comparative literature, psychology, and even the arts. We started the semester with a lecture series on new Holocaust research from Poland. It introduced emerging scholars in Poland, new documentation of Jewish life after World War II, and new interpretation of post-Holocaust Jewish experience. So that happened in September. In October, we had the second lecture series. It started late October, went into early November, and introduced faculty of ASU Jewish Studies. And the focus was on Christianity and historical perspectives. And in early November, to be precise, November 6th, we held a research conference, Jews in Italian Music Alive, 1450 to the present. And we hosted, as some of you I'm sure know, invited guest speakers, but also artists from Israel, from Italy, and from the United States. So if you missed any of these, you can find them on the website of Jewish Studies. I'm pretty sure that the material is available, and if not there yet, it will be there in a week or two. On November 13, right after the international conference, we hosted Dr. Ayelet Brin from University of Hartford, Connecticut, and she received the Baron Dissertation Award. Her lecture focused on gender, mass culture, and American Yiddish press, and she did her dissertation at University of Pennsylvania under the direction of Beth Wagner. Now, let me say a few words in case you missed her lecture. What is this Baron Dissertation Award? So it's named after Sarah Whitmire Baron. This award was established by Dr. Shoshana Baron Tenzer and her late husband, Robert Tenzer, to recognize and advance scholarship in Jewish studies by early career scholars. The award was named, of course, for Professor Salo Baron, who I can say, and maybe most people will agree with me, that he was the most important Jewish historian in the 20th century. He is also, and was also, the father of Dr. Shoshana Baron Tenzer. So Professor Baron trained scores of students, and his outstanding scholarship professionalized Jewish studies in the United States. It's no less than that. I won't give you his entire career. It's going to be too long to cover here. But let me just tell you that in 2015, the Center for Jewish Studies at ASU, together with Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, held a commemorative conference to examine the enduring legacy of Salo Baron. And it was a marvelous, absolutely marvelous conference. It's available in a book. If you want to, you can look up under the title of The Enduring Legacy of Salo Baron, and you will be able to purchase the book on Amazon. So Salo Whitmire Baron Dissertation Award is granted every 3 years to the best dissertation in Jewish history, with preference to American Jewish history. In 2012, that was our first dissertation award. We granted it to Dr. David Kaufman, who currently teaches at York University in Canada, in Toronto, Canada. And he focused on the history, his dissertation focused on the history of Jews in the Southwest of the United States. In 2015, we gave the award to Dr. Zev Elef, who is currently the president of Gratz College in Philadelphia, and whose dissertation focused on the establishment of rabbinic institutions in the United States, especially during the 19th century. And in 2018, the award was given to Dr. Geraldine Goodefin, and her work, which was comparative social history, that focused on the intersection of Jewish family law, modern nationalism, and Jewish migration experiences in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. So tonight, we are very fortunate to have with us one of the applicants to the Baron Dissertation Award this year. His name is Dr. Aaron Welt. He's currently a doctoral lecturer in the History Department and Jewish Studies program at Hunter College, which I'm sure you know is part of the City University of New York system. Dr. Welt has focused in his dissertation on kind of I would call it the underbelly of Jewish history, if I may say so, namely organized crime in the Jewish experience at in the beginning of the 20th century. The title of his lecture for tonight is Strong-Armed Organized Crime and the Jewish Ethnic Economy in New York. And you will see that we will hear how a lot of interesting issues come to bear, kind of organized crime, the labor movement, the need for Jewish immigrants, how to address the needs of Jewish immigrants. All this together is kind of integrated in a very interesting way. So we thought the topic is absolutely fascinating, and we are going to listen now to Aaron Welt. Aaron, the screen is yours, and I'm going to turn off the camera and the audio so we can all listen to you. So welcome to ASU.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very warm welcome. I appreciate it. Thank you all for being here tonight and for having me. In particular, thanks to the Arizona State University Jewish Studies Department and the program's assistant, Lisa Kaplan, who was so helpful in arranging tonight's lecture. So thank you, Lisa. The research I'm going to be presenting grew out of the graduate dissertation I completed at New York University, and it will offer an outline of my current book project titled Strong-Armed Racketeering in American Jewish History, 1890 to 1932. So on May 12, 1915, a remarkable, if little noted event in American Jewish history occurred in Washington, D.C. during the proceedings of the Congressional Committee on Industrial Relations, the CCIR. Legislators created this commission 3 years before in the aftermath of the bombing of the Los Angeles Times building by two union activists, the brothers John and James McNamara, who targeted the newspaper for its anti-labor coverage. The attack, which killed almost 24 people, stood as a stark reminder of the persistence of deadly class conflict in Gilded Age and Progressive Era America. During a period when American workers launched hundreds of strikes each year, the CCIR took up the task of trying to understand why working class Americans across ethnicities and industries seem so discontent with their position in American society. In early May of 1915, the committee summoned the police commissioner of New York City, Arthur Woods, to offer his insights on the issues of political radicalism and industrial violence. The questioning soon turned to Benjamin Fine, popularly known as, quote, Dopey Benny, a Jewish gangster who by 1915 had become a dominant figure in the worlds of both organized crime and the labor movement of Jewish immigrant workers in New York City. After a rapid rise as the leading gangster in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a neighborhood that more Jewish immigrants than any other in America called home, Dopey Benny Fine decided to confess to city authorities his dealings with various labor leaders. Quote, what organizations are affected by these indictments? The commission members asked. Quote, largely the East Side Hebrew trades, is it not? To which Police Commissioner Woods replied, quote, yes, I think so. And with that utterance, Police Commissioner Woods confirmed before Congress that organized crime in New York City obtained heightened influence due to immigrant Jewish business practices and the so-called, quote, Hebrew trades. Back in New York City, among Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrants arriving by the thousands and seeking economic stability in America, a word began to emerge to describe the type of person behind the problems Arthur Woods hinted at before Congress, and that word was starker, an American Yiddish term meaning strong-arm man. A few months before Commissioner Woods' testimony, the English language press in New York warned readers about the growing threat of starkers. The New York Times in January of 1915 reported, quote, "The district attorney has heard from various sources that the employment which the unions give to gangmen as starkers or strong-arm men for strike work is chiefly responsible for the existence of the gangs. The heads of the two largest gangs, one of them being Dopey Benny Fine, the other being a Romanian Jewish immigrant named Joseph Rosenzweig," the quote continues, "who are now under arrest, have confessed that they receive large salaries from the unions." In the years leading up to his arrest in late 1914, Dopey Benny Fine allied with the Jewish immigrant labor leader Morris Sigmund, as the two helped make the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU, one of the most powerful institutions in the developing system of Jewish immigrant capitalism. Fine would likewise forge a working relationship with the United Hebrew Trades, the UHT, another dominant organization among the Jewish immigrant working class of Progressive era New York. Over a pivotal couple of years, when both progressive reform captured New York City's politics and Jewish migration to the city reached a crescendo, Jewish unions and gangsters bridged an alliance, a partnership that elevated the Jewish labor movement to be a central institution in the integration of Jewish immigrants into American life. This project seeks to explain who were the starkers of progressive era New York. What can their history tell us about the Jewish diaspora to Gilded Age and progressive era America? In digging deeper into figures like Benny Fine, Joe Rosenzweig, and some of the other gangsters and labor activists I will discuss in this presentation, scholars of American Jewish history can probe into bigger, more pressing questions concerning the ways the mass migration of Jews impacted American society. Why exactly did the Jewish labor movement decide to ally with organized crime? And what does this relationship between the Jewish immigrant working class on the one hand and New York's criminal underworld on the other tell us about how Jews adapted to the norms of American capitalism? The sociologist Daniel Bell was the son of a Jewish immigrant garment worker, and growing up in the Lower East Side in the early 20th century, he became active in socialist politics and in the labor movement. In a way, Bell's 1953 essay, Crime as an American Way of Life, gives us a clue into some of the questions I just posed. He writes, quote, "In a highly chaotic and cutthroat industry such as clothing, the racketeer paradoxically played a stabilizing role by regulating competition and fixing prices. In other types of racketeering, such as trucking perishable foods and waterfront loading, where the racketeers entrenched themselves as middlemen, a pattern of accommodation was roughly worked out, and the rackets assumed a quasi-legal veneer. During the period of mass migration, Jewish workers allied with organized crime in an effort to bring order to a rapidly expanding Jewish ethnic economy. By Jewish ethnic economy, I mean an economic system in which Jewish immigrant business owners employed more recently arrived Jewish newcomers, and very often they did so in small-scale shops, where workers might speak Yiddish to one another, and where there was not a vast social gap between employer and employee, not always, but generally. the boss perhaps only a few years before having been a factory worker themselves. This Jewish ethnic economy most fully developed within New York City's needle trades, the making of various types of clothing throughout the 4 distinct fashion seasons. As I will show, before Jewish unions began allying with gangsters, Jewish immigrant employers took advantage of the Lower East Side's criminal underworld in order to break strikes, to intimidate, harass, or physically assault union activists, and to buy influence with Tammany Hall, the city's powerful political machine. In response to the growth of the dubiously legal strike-breaking industry, Jewish immigrant labor leaders like Morris Sigmund tapped the leading gangsters headquartered in New York's Yiddish-speaking neighborhoods to work on behalf of the ILGWU, the UHT, the Hebrew Bakers Unions, and other labor groups. These Yiddische Starkie emerged as colorful and well-known characters in Jewish immigrant New York. Not only did they assist Jewish workers in winning better wages and working conditions, Starkers were also active in the Lower East Side's nightlife and recreational culture. The persona of the Starker came to serve as a template of performative masculinity, a mold of behaviors and norms accessible to young Jewish immigrant and second-generation men in an era when Jewish men were often portrayed as weak and limited in their physical abilities. While progressive era New York's Jewish gangsters did play some redeeming social function, their criminal behavior and public displays of violence ultimately proved too problematic in an era of growing nativism and anti-Semitism in American life. Accordingly, the historian Jenna Josselett, who's written probably the best book on this subject of Jews and crime in American life, Josselett argues that racketeers like Dopey Benny Fine came to be viewed as, quote, the black sheep, outsiders, pariahs of the Jewish immigrant community, bad actors who exploited workers, served no social purpose, and threatened the standing of all American Jews. Eric Hobsbawm seemingly agrees, writing in Bandits, his landmark study of pre-modern social banditry, quote, even today, Jews willing to claim revolutionaries as their own, a Marx or a Trotsky, are apologetic about their Meyer Lanskys, end quote. Strongarm argues that the truth is more complicated. The Yiddish Starkie did serve a social function, one which proved beneficial to the masses of Jewish immigrants as they integrated into American capitalism. By serving as the Jewish labor movement's strong-arm force, gangsters helped to ensure that unions enjoyed the most authority in New York's needle trades, as well as in other chaotic industries like the city's kosher food markets, urban construction, Yiddish stage production, the Yiddish theater, a host of small-scale manufacturing enterprises, and just about all the businesses that Jews and other immigrants found employment in when they first came to America. By centering the Starker in the drama of the Jewish diaspora to Gilded Age and Progressive Era America, Strongarm destabilizes conventional scholarly interpretations of how Jews met American capitalism and how Jews shaped modern American politics. So here is just more press coverage of Dopey Benny Fine. If there's time at the end, I'd be happy to go over some more of these images and things that you see in the slideshow. Also a interview with Henry Ford, the industrialist, on Dopey Benny Fine from 1915. So the alliance between the Jewish labor movement in America and organized crime was not inevitable. In fact, the early history of Jewish unions, both in the US and in Eastern Europe, conveys that Hobsbawm assessment is correct, at least for a bit, that the Jewish working class generally viewed the criminal underworld with disdain. One episode from 1905 in particular is instructive. Over the preceding decades, Jews in Russia had left by the millions no longer willing to put up with poverty and persecution, and now able to leave the empire by a growing network of railroads connected to port cities. As revolution gripped Tsarist Russia, the Jewish Labor Bund galvanized the Yiddish working class, organizing tens of thousands of Jewish industrial laborers into radical unions. Dedicated to Marxist socialism and the promotion of Yiddish national culture, the Bund locked horns with Tsar Nicholas II and his apparatus of state repression. But in May of 1905, the Bund of the eminent city of Warsaw set its sights on the Jewish underworld. So here's some press coverage of this event. Jews fighting Jews in Warsaw, 8 dead. Socialist society makes war on disreputable resorts. Pound jewelry with stones. Reformers smash into houses and utterly wreck them. Cossacks use guns after hours of rioting. Bundist activists wrecked Jewish-owned brothels and casinos. They took whatever money and jewels they found, and they killed about 8 Jewish criminals in an event historians have dubbed, quote, the pimp pogrom. So this event illustrates that the Jewish workers' movement of Russia viewed the urban underworld as an oppositional force, a segment of industrial society that distracted the masses from class conflict and revolution. One of the millions of Jewish immigrants who left Russia in these years was Joseph Baron Dess. Docking in New York on May 25th, 1888, Baron Dess first hoped to find work as a Yiddish actor. But after that did not work out, he found a job like thousands of other Jewish immigrant men as a cloak maker. The same year he arrived, the UHT organizer, Bernard Weinstein, an immigrant from Odessa, noticed the aspiring actor's theatrical personality and recruited Baron Dess to lead an organizing effort among the city's cloak makers. Baron Dess's rise as a labor activist coincided with the rapid development of the garment sweatshop system in the Jewish ethnic economy. In particular, cloak-making workers like Baron Dess led the struggle against what were called outside shops, essentially outsourced non-union manufacturing operations, and eventually Baron Dess would earn the moniker of the Moses of the cloak makers. But this newfound stature in the Jewish labor movement soon drew the attention of New York's police inspector Thomas Burns. A nationally renowned law enforcement figure, Police Inspector Burns despised political radicals and organized labor, and he helped to install a culture of brutality in the NYPD. For these reasons, Burns set his sights on Baron Dess and soon found a perfect excuse to bring the law down upon the Moses of the cloak makers following the so-called Jamaica affair. In early 1891, a group of Jewish immigrant sweatshop bosses established a string of outside sweatshops in Jamaica, Long Island, Queen.
Aaron, are you
Aaron,
muted? Can
yeah.
you bring him back?
Yeah, Aaron, I think we lost your audio for a minute. Did we lose him altogether?
Yes.
Give him a second to reconnect.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I see that. We lost him altogether. Thank you for bearing with us. Apparently there's bad rainstorms and here we go. Hi, Aaron, how are you? Welcome back.
That was me, but I lost connection there for a second.
No problem. Please continue.
Oh, I need to share the slideshow.
Oh, got you. That's that I can do. Hold on.
Apologies for the technical errors here.
Why don't I see you? Let me try it this way. Okay. You should be a co-host now.
Great. Okay. Sorry again. Apologies about that. All right. Where were we? The Jamaica affair. Right. So in early 1891, a group of Jewish immigrant sweatshop bosses established these outside sweatshops in Jamaica, Long Island. In March, after Baron Dess and a number of other cloak makers learned about the Jamaica operation, the labor leader dispatched a posse of union activists to disrupt these scab shops. What transpired next is a matter of debate. The striking cloak makers stormed into the four-room tenement sweatshop run by the contractors Herman Greenbaum and Samuel Bolletz, two Russian Jewish immigrant entrepreneurs. A confrontation broke out, and in the commotion, boiling water used to keep the presser irons hot spilled, burning the leg of Greenbaum's young child. The day after this Jamaica raid, the English language press depicted the cloak makers as dangerous foreign radicals. They called the cloak makers, as you can see, the vitriol gang, with the New York Times reporting, quote, Joseph Baron Dess, leader of the striking cloak makers, and 11 of the men who made the raid on Monday on the shop of Herman Greenbaum in Jamaica, Long Island, were captured last night when the police descended upon the meeting of the strikers, 385 Bowery near 6th Street. Inspector Burns says he has evidence to prove not only that Baron Dess instigated the raid, but that he provided money to purchase the vitriol, which was thrown over Greenbaum's child and the goods in the shop. So the hysteria whipped up by the press led Police Inspector Thomas Burns to target Baron Dess. And in short order, Burns had him arrested and placed in the notorious Tombs jailhouse. Baron Dess managed to secure bail, but he was promptly rearrested in a second frame-up. This time, Inspector Burns convinced two garment businessmen, Abraham Hopkins and Abraham Marks of the firm Popkin and Marks, to press charges against Baron Dess in an alleged extortion scheme. As city prosecutors would argue during his April 1891 trial, Joseph Baron Dess presented Popkin and Marks with a corrupt scheme in which the cloak manufacturers would pay Baron Dess and his cronies several $100s or face a walkout of their workers. However, the trial revealed that there likely had been no extortion plot. Moreover, during the trial, the prosecution tested a new legal tactic. When Baron Dess's union colleague, Maurice Zipkin, took the stand, the assistant DA raised the issue of Zipkin and Baron Dess's membership in the Knights of Labor, a group still largely associated in the public's mind with Chicago's deadly Haymarket riot of 1886. The DA suggestively posed the question, quote, and you have been an intimate friend of the
Oh no, I'm afraid we might have lost Aaron again. Oh, hey, okay, good.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure what's going on here. I'm all plugged in and everything. Okay, I didn't lose the sharing here. Okay, sorry about that again. All right, so the DA asked this suggestive question, have you been an intimate friend of the gentleman referred to as Herr Most, which was a reference to the infamous German-American anarchist Johann Most, a figure also associated with the Haymarket bombing. Okay, so you see what the prosecution is trying to do here. A jury eventually found Baron Dess guilty of extortion, and he was sentenced to almost 2 years in Sing Sing prison. Throughout these tribulations, Baron Dess told union colleagues that police beat and tortured him, that he was kept in deplorable prison conditions, and that he felt targeted for his labor activism. Over the 1890s, the Jewish labor movement enjoyed limited and fleeting success. One clear reason for this, as the trials of Joseph Baron Dess demonstrate, was that law enforcement criminalized union leaders, people like Joseph Baron Dess, decisively tipping the balance in favor of employers. in protecting the sweatshop system of garment production. Labor leaders like Baron Des came to distrust the police, not only for their treatment of unions, but also because of their connections with Tammany Hall and New York City's underworld. In 1900, Baron Des declared before a union convention, quote, "I want to serve notice to these police that labor can start a crusade against them, as well as Dr. Parkhurst, if they do not leave the pickets alone." Dr. Parkhurst being a famous anti-vice moral crusader in New York City over the 1890s, who spotlighted Tammany Hall and NYPD corruption. He continued, quote, "We know what crimes they foster and will expose them as they have never been exposed before." The trials of Joseph Baron Des convey the blurry boundaries of the law and illegality in union affairs, a boundary that Jewish immigrants would contest as the Jewish ethnic economy continued to expand with the unfolding Jewish diaspora to America. So after sluggish growth in the 1890s, the Jewish labor movement grew by leaps and bounds over the first decades of the new century. Following the creation of the ILGWU in 1900, the union expanded quickly. In 1909 and 1910, two massive strikes erupted in New York's shirtwaist and cloak making trades, strikes that came to be known as the Great Revolts. The Great Revolts ended in a landmark labor accord known as the Protocols of Peace, an agreement that brought tens of thousands of Jewish, Italian, and other immigrant workers into the ILGWU. The Great Revolts and the Protocols of Peace represent significant turning points in American Jewish history, but what's often been overlooked in the aftermath of these events was the growing convergence between Jewish immigrant capitalism and the city's underworld. From 1900 to 1915, even as the Jewish labor movement reached new heights of power, the strike-breaking industry made major inroads in the Jewish ethnic economy of New York, and it did so by connecting with organized crime. Okay. So the document you see here is from an anti-crime organization called the Bureau of Social Morals, which was a group affiliated with Jewish charities that hired Yiddish-speaking detectives to infiltrate and break up criminal networks operating in the Lower East Side. So this document concerns a 1912 strike of thousands of Jewish and Greek workers in the fur industry. And it reads, quote, "The present strike from the side of the Furriers Association, commonly known as the Bosses Union, is to be broken by the gangs of thugs and women beaters, most of them being thieves, pimps, so-called strong-arm men, and on the Italian side, cutthroats, murderers, pimps of the worst kind, and whatnot." A lot of these documents kind of read like this. So, the Furriers Association has hired through a police patrol and detective agency run by a certain Schlansky on Grand Street. Through this association, the mob is paid indirectly, the money being handled by the agency. The following are the names and addresses of the boss's furriers who are directly responsible for the hiring of the guerrillas. And so it then lists 13 major fur factories operating in New York who hire these strong-arm men. And then it goes on to state, just one second here, they are known on the East Side as Yiddische Starkers, in plain English, Jewish strong-arm men. Okay. So the report goes on to detail these Yiddische Starker mentioned, all of whom were immigrants from Russia who had accomplished criminal careers, and they all had some connection with Tammany Hall. Another important development from 1909 was the election of Mayor William Gaynor, who enjoyed some independence from the Tammany machine. Enjoying more autonomy, Mayor Gaynor reined in the NYPD, including banning the practice of factory owners deputizing cops during strikes. Despite these reforms, New York's needle trades employers found novel ways to guard their factories from union activists. As a number of historians have shown, garment employers made all sorts of arrangements with violent and criminal actors throughout the waist makers and cloak makers strike. The Rosen Brothers plant, a large firm in the shirtwaist trade, hired sex workers to confront and start fights with picketing women. It's hard to know why sex workers would attack other working class Jewish women, both perhaps experiencing the same challenges of being young, foreign born, poor, and a woman in progressive era New York. However, BOSM reports on prostitution in the Lower East Side reveal that male pimps who were still dominant in the sex trades could very often be violent and cruel to sex workers. The Shirtwaist Factory of Louis Laserson hired two male gangsters, an Italian named Lawrence Ferrone and a Jewish thug named Velvel Billy Lustig. On September 10th, 1909, Ferrone and Lustig viciously assaulted the Jewish immigrant union activist Clara Lemlich, breaking her ribs and leaving her in the hospital for 6 weeks. Isaac Harris and Max Blank, managers of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in Greenwich Village, employed a host of brutal enforcers to keep union campaigns at bay, a practice they continued even after a catastrophic fire in their factory killed nearly 150 workers in March of 1911. But it is really in the aftermath of the Great Revolts when we begin to see a cohort of entrepreneurs hoping to become rich in the union busting industry expand strike-breaking operations into the New York's Jewish ethnic economy. Big corporations like the Pinkertons, the William J. Burns Detective Agency, or the Baldwin Felts Company, they did seek to cash in on New York's market for strike-breaking, but it was more nimble firms, businesses that enjoyed local connections into the working class community and who were able to come into direct contact with those willing to commit violence or do scab labor during strikes, which really managed to thrive. For instance, the strike-breaking businessman Valerie O'Farrell. O'Farrell was a product of the Lower East Side's Irish community, and he followed a common track of employment. He moved from NYPD cop to private detective to then the manager of his own strike-breaking firm. O'Farrell his first business niche was breaking the strikes that would erupt periodically in New York's rail and subway lines. But he encountered a problem when he began to get involved in the needle trades. So here is another BOSM report on Val O'Farrell. O'Farrell struggled to find good garment workers to act as scabs, as it states, quote, "A good mechanic is not needed for this kind of work, whereas to get men to supplant the strikers in the shops is a practical impossibility because threading a needle and making a coat or sewing on buttons or making buttonholes or pressing a sleeve is not collecting fares on a streetcar or driving an express wagon. It takes a few years of apprenticeship to become a fairly good tailor or presser." So it goes on to mention for the manufacturers, Ike Silverman and Val O'Farrell, formerly a lieutenant first grade detective who traveled with Kinsler and Dugan with offices at 149 Broadway and the Singer Building, employ 125 strikebreakers. Ike Silverman, who you see mentioned there, was a private detective employed by a clothing manufacturers association. He helped O'Farrell recruit the personnel he needed in New York's Jewish neighborhoods in order to break strikes in the garment industry. And the most successful union busting firm that arose from within New York's Jewish ethnic economy was that belonging to Max Schlansky, another ex-cop turned strike-breaking businessman. So in this document on the Jewish strong-arm men in the first strike of 1912, the report mentioned certain Italians. The Italian referred to here specifically was Giacomo Jack Sirocco, who was one of the top mafia dons in Little Italy in this period. Over the years 1911 and 1912, Schlansky forged a series of agreements with Sirocco, in which Slansky could use his gang members to act as guards and enforcers to break strikes in the needle trades. Sirocco began to do deals with other employers, including kosher chicken businesses, and Slansky likewise began to do business with other Italian gangsters, notably Antonio Vaccarelli. Importantly, mafiosos like Sirocco and Vaccarelli began to enjoy some sway in Tammany Hall as the machine sought to court the growing Italian immigrant vote in New York City. And so this conjoining of Jewish strikebreaking agencies with Italian organized crime is central to this history. And it led to scenes like the following. Okay, so this is another BOSM report. It reads, at 2:30 p.m. this afternoon, there was a fight between Doggy's mob that works for the union and Kelly's Italian mob that works for the manufacturers. Doggy's men went up to the Frankel System Clothing Company on 18th Street and 5th Avenue, where an attempt was made to take the scabs down. To take down the men. Kelly's guerrillas interfered and would not let them take the scabs down. A battle followed, and in the free-for-all fight, a few people were hurt. Reserves of the West 17th Street police station were called, and it took 1 full hour to quiet things down. 2 of Kelly's guerrillas were arrested. So you see how violence is erupting in people's factories because of this emerging system of organized labor's influence in labor affairs. As Jewish immigrant employers allied with organized crime, Morris Sigmund and the Jewish labor movement began to take matters into their own hands, leading to one of the first recorded instances of racketeering in American history. In 1912, Morris Sigmund and Abraham Mitchell, representing the ILGWU, sat down with Dopey Benny Fine at Charlie Rosenzweig's Cabaret and Saloon on 4th Street and 2nd Avenue, an establishment that the BOSM had labeled, quote, a whorehouse. The location was likely chosen because Rosenzweig's bar also served as a well-known labor exchange, where union chiefs or factory bosses could meet young, tough men willing to do violent strike work for cash. At Rosenzweig's saloon, the 3 reached an agreement. As Fine later told a grand jury, quote, well, they told me they were going out on a general strike and they wanted the scabs all kept away. They wanted me to protect the pickets walking up and down the street and be up at 5 o'clock in the morning at the location of the factory. And in case anybody assaults the pickets, why we should assault them. From the years 1911 to 1915, following Sigmund's fateful meeting with Dopey Benny Fine, Jewish organized crime proved a crucial pillar in the rise of the Jewish labor movement. Morris Sigmund was a Yiddish-speaking Russian Jewish immigrant who in the 1920s would go on to serve as the president of the ILGWU. Upon first arriving in the US, Sigmund had been a member of the Radical Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. But in 1910, signaling a growing moderation, Sigmund agreed to sign the Moderate Protocols of Peace. But over the following year, Sigmund clearly changed his outlook, and he began to forge a working relationship with New York's Jewish underworld. Dopey Benny, born Benjamin Feinschneider, grew up in the Lower East Side to Jewish immigrant parents, Jacob Fein and his wife Mary, both from Russia. During his youth, Benny, like many poor boys in big cities, got into trouble with the law, and consequently, he spent a good portion of his early years in reformatories and prisons, where he was kept with seasoned criminals and exposed to violence. Dopey Benny, so called because of a droopy eye caused by a retinal disorder, rose the ranks of New York City's Yiddish underworld as a top deputy to the powerful Jewish gangster Big Jack Zelig. Jack Zelig built his criminal empire as the muscle behind the Lower East Side's illegal casinos. Fine decided to pave his own path, becoming the ever-reliable Yiddisher Starker for the Jewish labor movement. Throughout the 1910s, as Fine reported in his grand jury testimony, Dopey Benny refused to use his gang to break strikes, turning down lucrative offers from representatives of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, the White Goods Manufacturing Association, Max Schlansky and his detective agency, the Berghoff Brothers Company, which was an even bigger strike-breaking firm, and the powerful kosher chicken entrepreneur Barnett Bath. What's more, Benny's relationship with his father, Jacob Fine, further indicates that viewing the Yiddische Starker as the black sheep of American Jewry requires some revision. A struggling tailor and a loyal union member for all of his life, Jacob Fine never appears to have dissuaded his son from his career as a Starker. To the contrary, Jacob Fine would often host meetings with union officials in his modest Eldridge Street tenement apartment for them to work out deals with Benny. In the teeming streets of the Lower East Side, Benny Fine and other Jewish immigrants stood out among their peers. From time to time, Benny would throw parties in the neighborhood that attracted a good number of young people, organized by, quote, private clubs he set up, which was a legal loophole that entitled a club owner to restrict who could enter their party, such as undercover police or perhaps detectives from anti-vice groups. So one such club that Dopey Bennied was called the Peacock Club. And you can see the little card for that club in the bottom of the screen. This club would throw soirees in the Lower East Side. More significantly, Jewish strong-arm men like Dopey Benny Fine proved their value to the larger Jewish working class during labor disputes, which continued to be chaotic and sometimes deadly. And so that leads us to the Feldman Hat Strike of November 1913. In this bloody episode, the Feldman Hat Factory employed Max Schlansky to break a strike, who in turn hired gangsters from Soroko's mob. A gunfight broke out between one of Soroko's men and a Dopey Benny gang member named Max Greenwald, who would later die from his wounds. Gang members like Max Greenwald and Benny Fine stood at the front lines in protecting workers from companies like Schlansky's detective agency. In the fur industry, that role was taken up by Joe Rosenzweig, nicknamed Joe the Greaser, and who acted as the Starker for the Furriers Union until he too was arrested in 1915. In fact, between 1912 and 1915, a whole cohort of about a dozen or so Jewish strong-arm men emerged in the trades that depended on Jewish immigrant labor. One of these figures definitely worth mentioning is Max Kazimierski, who is a Russian Jewish immigrant who served simultaneously as the president of the Hebrew Bakers Unions in New York and as the union's strong-arm enforcer, and kind of a gangster in his own right, too. And so in this respect, the Yiddische Starke of the progressive era Jewish labor movement align with Eric Hobsbawm's understanding of social bandits in pre-industrial societies, meaning these people were outlaws who used violence and force in order to achieve some small measure of social justice. And if we have time at the end, I can return to this document, but I think I'm pressed for time here, so I'll move forward. While the Yiddische Starke did allow Jewish unions to gain power, influence, an alliance with organized crime always came with many liabilities. During this period of mass Jewish migration and progressive urban reform, Jewish immigrant workers devising their own extra-legal methods of policing the industrial economy of America's largest city ultimately proved too much. And these events all came to a head in the spring and summer of 1915 during the so-called Trial of the Seven Cloakmakers, a legal saga involving the mysterious murder of a Jewish immigrant named Hyman Leibowitz. So Hyman Leibowitz arrived in America with his family just as the 1910 cloakmaker strike got underway in New York. Desperate for work, Leibowitz decided to follow a group of scab garment workers to the rural town of Hunter, New York, where strike-breaking operations persisted. However, after making the trek upstate, a mole, a spy, planted by the ILGWU, revealed himself to his fellow Jewish garment workers and convinced them to leave the scab shops in Hunter to return to Union headquarters in New York City. Leibowitz agreed to do so, arriving at the ILGWU's strike offices in Lower Manhattan around midnight. He had a brief and uneventful meeting with Morris Sigmund and some other of the ILGWU officials. Then, as Leibowitz left Union headquarters for his home in Brooklyn, a fight broke out, and Leibowitz received a fatal blow to the head, leading to his death several days later. The murder of Hyman Leibowitz remained a mystery until a shadowy figure named Max Sulkus became involved in the case. The BOSM had been tracking Sulkus for years, describing him in various crime reports as, quote, a fixer, someone involved in kind of illegal machinations, and a fence of stolen goods. The 1910 census lists him reporting from prison, so we know he had some kind of criminal record. But in the early 1910s, Sulkus began to use his underworld connections in establishing a union-busting detective agency. Over 1913 and 1914, Sulkus arranged a number of meetings with the district attorney's office, during which he supplied prosecutors with witnesses who testified to having seen Morris Sigmund and other union officials assault and kill Hyman Leibowitz in the summer of 1910. DA Charles Whitman ordered Sigmund and 6 other top ILGWU chiefs arrested, and they were tried for murder in September and October of 1915, facing a possible death sentence. Before Morris Sigmund's murder trial commenced, which many in the media called the trial of the 7 cloak makers, the city's press circulated tales of criminal tyranny in New York's Jewish unions. The New York Tribune blared, and you can see part of the headline there, 6 identified as union slayers. Eyewitnesses named Sigmund and Strongarm Moses as leaders. So Strongarm Moses was a reference to one of the defendants, Morris Stucknicker, an ILGWU organizer who throughout the trial, the prosecution tried to portray as this bellicose giant of a man who terrorized non-union Jewish workers. The robust and rough masculinity forged by Joseph Baron Dess and developed by New York City's Yiddish Starkey provided immigrant Jewish men with a blueprint of behaviors from which to project strength and defiance in the face of adversity. But during the trial of the 7 cloak makers, this iteration of Jewish immigrant masculinity played into nativist rhetoric that depicted Jewish men as a dangerous influence on contemporary American gender norms. Moreover, Morris Sigmund's testimony on the stand revealed the existence of a woman nicknamed Brother Dora, who was the ILGWU's female enforcer, tasked with keeping the thousands of women in the union's ranks in line. The prosecution also tried to make a big deal of Sigmund's brief time in the IWW as evidence that he must be a dangerous radical comfortable with violence and murder, but the jury ultimately did not buy the prosecution's story. In early October, all 7 cloak makers were found not guilty, prompting a major celebration across the Lower East Side. The trial of the 7 cloak makers offers in microcosm how American Jews experienced the ubiquitous social issue of violent class conflict in progressive era America, and the ways Jews sought to navigate and contain this violence as they integrated into American capitalism. Okay, so I believe I'm running out of time. And so to wrap up, I'm just going to explain how I see this story coming to a conclusion. Following World War I and the coming of the 1920s, immigration restriction and prohibition fundamentally disrupted the social conditions that had led to the creation of the Yiddische Starkie in the progressive era. The prospect of making a large fortune in bootlegging attracted a good number of Jewish gangsters who might otherwise have stayed involved in union affairs. One example was a Russian Jewish immigrant, New Yorker named Meyer Lansky, who after being arrested as a union strong-arm man in 1917, emerged over the 1920s as a leading bootlegger and gambler nationwide. But one gangster in particular preserved racketeering as a lucrative underworld activity heading into the 1920s, and that was Nate Kaplan, known in the underworld as Kid Dropper. Kaplan not only muscled into a number of unions over the 1920s, but he also began to expand his extortion operation over small businesses as well, most notably laundromats in the laundromat business. After threatening a laundry worker, a boxer, and a gang member named Joseph Cohen, Cohen assassinated Nate Kaplan outside the Essex Market Courthouse in the Lower East Side in 1923. With racketeering now an integral part of New York's industrial economy, organized crime played a major role in the so-called ILGW Civil War of the 1920s. This event refers to when moderate socialists and radical communists fought each other for dominance over this union and dominance in the garment industry. This intra-labor conflict only ended when Arnold Rothstein, the preeminent crime boss of 1920s New York, brokered a ceasefire between the two parties. Lastly, out of the ILGWU Civil War emerged a Jewish gangster named Louis Lepke Buchhalter, who would go on to become one of the most notorious and powerful racketeers in American history. And this is where strong arm will end, with the rise of industrial scale racketeering during the New Deal era, led by Lepke Buchhalter and a new group called Murder Incorporated. All right, everyone, thank you so much for listening. I apologize for the technical issues we experienced. We got through them. Here is also just a condensed bibliography of some of the works used. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, this was a very, shall I say, intriguing kind of topic. And you can take off your shared screen, right, Aaron? So we can see
Yeah, I can do that.
Stanley and you. And okay, great. Thank you so much. So Stanley, I'm going to pose the question to you first. Would you like to start with a particular issue on your mind as you're listening, and then I can come up with my question?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I actually have two things that I want to ask Aaron to expand on. But first, let me just congratulate you on this work. It's really important. Makes me wish I had a Jewish gangster name, like Purvis the Moocher or something. But it was something I still workshop. So the two issues I want you to expand on. Number one is I really think, as I'm listening to this, I was thinking how much Sela Baron, I believe, would have loved this project. This is, I think, the essence of the anti-lacrimose view of Jewish studies, right? That Jews are not this perpetual victims. It's not this veil of tears. And in a lot of ways, criminality can be seen, especially this type of criminality connected to labor markets, as a type of resistance, as a type of agency, right? It's Jews, you could see Jews as kind of taking control of their own circumstances. And I think that's how maybe Sela Baron would have seen this, as a model of anti-lacrimose Jewish studies. So the first question I have then is, how do you see this work expanding, let's say, beyond the specifically American? I mean, you're very localized in the Lower East Side of New York City, I guess a little bit in Queens, because we had Jamaica at least. But but that aside, do you see this as having broader implications for just Jewish studies writ large, just in the way we conceive of being Jewish? And then my next question is about the cultural dynamics of this. So you had mentioned the procurers, the Jewish pimps, Like, and I was reminded of the procurers in Argentina and who created the Migdal Tzvi Society. So these are people trafficking in women out of Eastern Europe, and they were very culturally Jewish. They had their own synagogue. They had their own minyanim, right? They had people coming to synagogue to pray with the procurers. They have their own cemetery. So my second question is, do you see an element of that in the Lower East Side that is like kind of overtly culturally Jewish beyond just the fact that they're speaking Yiddish? Is there something culturally Jewish about them? And I guess why that's an important question is, could you just sort of take the Italian organized crime or the Irish organized crime and just kind of, transpose them? Could you just take one for the other? Or is there something specifically Jewish about these guys that wouldn't have been an element in the Irish or the Italian mafia? But so those are my questions. And I just thank you again for sharing your findings with us.
Oh, well, I'm more than happy to. And thank you for those very kind words about how Salon Baron would have thought of this project. That's hugely meaningful. So thank you. And I am very much influenced by Baron, kind of pushing back against lachrymose interpretations. I mean, to begin with, I mentioned this, I think I use this word, Jewish community, American Jews, but to begin this project, you cannot think of Jews as one singular group, right? I mean, that's what kind of binds this project together. But class really divided Jews in this period of history. And I think this gets to the bigger issue, because class divided Americans during this period of American Jewish history. This, I think, and this is the point I was trying to make, talking about the trial of the 7 cloakmakers, is this is how this Jewish ethnic economy experiences this moment in American history, when there are so many strikes. And this kind of pattern of American capitalist development pits workers against their employers in all these different industries, year after year, with seemingly no resolution. And so what's Jewish about this story, culturally Jewish? I think there's something politically Jewish about this story, which is that, Jews coming from Eastern Europe had all these political institutions that they're fraying clearly with, the decline of the Russian Empire and the rise of Russian cities. But, an organization like an institution like the Kahal, the local Jewish government in a lot of these Eastern European cities that, often was run by the elite, but they're the intermediaries between Jews and the larger empires that they live in. And so what's interesting with Jews in the progressive era is you see them often replicate that model of politics rather than, deferring to the the American authorities. There's a kind of intra-Jewish discussion about how to resolve class conflict. Get these gangsters to go and talk to the bosses and resolve things before they break out into strikes. Racketeering, basically the threat of violence hovering over non-sanctioned economic practices. Immigrants coming into a garment shop and saying, sure, I'll work for 50 cents a day, right? So this racketeering story, I think it has a political transatlantic importance. And that's a little bit what I try and do in looking at the pimp pogrom, how the Bund is trying to kind of be that force in Eastern Europe. And these racketeering networks, the ILGWU and the gangsters, they being the kind of authoritative force in Jewish industries in New York. That's, I think, another kind of layer of analysis that I'm trying to develop. So I hope that answered your questions.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Chava, did you have a question, or do you want to go to the chat?
So my question is actually it's a nice follow-up to yours. I would like to talk a little bit more, or for you to talk a little bit more about Jewish masculinity concept that you introduced here.
Yeah.
But I would like you to compare it to the Zionist understanding of Jewish masculinity, because it's happening exactly at the same time, but it's very different. So here it's the use of violence, and actually against Jews, not necessarily against non-Jews, right? So whereas in Zionism, masculinity had to do more with farming. It was connected to land cultivation. So it seems to me that
Yeah.
the souls of, they're both about how to become a new kind of Jew, but it's done in very, very different ways with different ideological justifications. So I'm intrigued by that. Of course, coming from Israel, I prefer the Zionist model, but still, I would like to know what you make of this masculinity, because it's fascinating.
Yeah, and again, what connects both is the breakdown of kind of traditional Jewish life in the Pale of Settlement, in the shtetl, over the late 19th century. So the older model of Jewish masculinity in traditional societies was a man who could study Torah and Talmud and religious texts all day. That was the epitome of masculine, because that was an all masculine space in Eastern Europe. Then with Jewish exposure to modernity, nationalism, socialism, what have you, they're all imagining a remaking of the Jewish male body, as well as Jewish women too, that women are put into these strange gendered relationships because of traditional Jewish life. In America, there's all these, and this Abe Kahan talks about this, all sorts of commentators on American Jewish life talk about ways Jewish immigrants can remake their masculinity in America. The rabbis aren't in charge, religious society is not in charge. You have Jewish boxers, you have all these kind of American models of masculinity to follow. Many Americans are saying Jewish men, and this is the era of social Darwinism. There's this idea that Jewish men genetically are different than non-Jewish men. There's this idea that Jewish men are weak, that they're naturally not built for hard labor. The Zionists are certainly trying to reform that conception. The gangsters, in a certain sense, and the gangster union figure, the racketeer, is creating this kind of new urban working class immigrant American Jewish masculinity. And it becomes a mold of behaviors that you see kind of passed on from Joseph Baron-Dess, then to Morris Sigmund, then to David Dubinsky, who follows Morris Sigmund, who has this, got to stick it to the capital, to capital kind of masculinity, resistant kind of behaviors. That is a very important model of masculinity for many Jews of that era. And even someone like Daniel Bell, who I mentioned before, he talks about the soapbox speakers in the Lower East Side, and that being kind of model of how to be a public actor in America. So yeah, I think these Jewish gangsters have a really important story, role in shaping gender norms for Jews in America. Yeah.
Stanley, can you go to the Q&A and see which questions we have? And Aaron,
sure. We've got 3 questions in the Q&A. And so Deborah Lerner asks, did your research include any of the Jewish gangsters involved in bootlegging? I am looking for information about Manny Kessler, known as the king of the Brooklyn bootleggers, as well as his cousin Morris Kessler, who was a chauffeur for the Arnberg gang in Brooklyn.
Oh yeah, well, they were pretty popular, ruthless, that gang. Yeah, I do focus on bootleggers a little bit as them breaking the story of racketeering, and that with the Volstead Act, with prohibition, there's now this new lucrative field of underworld of activity. You can make a living just transporting booze across state lines, across national lines, what have you. So Meyer Lansky, in the 1910s, we see he gets arrested for beating up a non-union plumber in Westchester County, just north of New York. Then in the 20s, clearly he links up with Arnold Rothstein and goes in this totally different direction. The members of Dopey Benny's gang, Benny Fine goes to jail and briefly in 1915. He kind of disappears from the underworld from that period. Other members of his gang then become major bootleggers, the most famous being Waxy Gordon, who started in Dopey Benny's gang as a labor racketeer. But what I'm kind of interested in is the gangsters who stayed in racketeering in the 1920s, who still viewed it as this critical part of how an industrial economy in New York is going to operate. There's always going to be some demand for a union strong-arm guy or a gangster who goes around threatening different small businesses. So, and Nate Kaplan, and then this other guy, Jacob Organ, Little Augie, as he was known, those were the two big figures in the 1920s.
And Manny Kessler, did you mention him?
I think I've come across the name perhaps, but if the person, I'd absolutely be happy to share my contact information. They can get in touch with me and I'll look through what I have and maybe I can send it their way.
Well, that dovetails well to the next question, which is Andrea asked if we can get a copy of the bibliography you had in your
oh yeah, I'd be happy to share it. Yeah. And I'd be happy to talk about archival sources that I've used. Obviously, the Bureau of Social Moral reports are just wild. I mean, there's really no other way to describe them. And so they're just a treasure trove. And this is, I think, one thing I've done differently than maybe other historians is looking at these crime documents as economic documents as well, and political documents. You know, what do they reveal about how Jews made a living in America or understood politics in America? And in that way, they're very revealing.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the fact that these guys were Jewish shaped the way that those reports were written?
Yes, I do, because the purpose of the Bureau of Social Morals specifically was to extricate Jews from crime, you know, to not bring a bad name to Jews, to fend off any possible arguments that could be made for nativism and immigration restriction. So yes, and this is also interesting, the vigilantes who start going after these Jewish gangsters, they start using lawless language and behavior themselves. They think it's so important to go after these gangsters that they don't use warrants, they, break property, they hurt people. So yeah, there is this fevered sense that there needs to be a strong reaction taken against Jewish criminals.
Is there anti-Semitic language that's used against these gangsters, like that Jews are especially criminal? I'm reminded, I forget who it was, I think the police chief of New York in the early 20th century had said that Jews are responsible for half the crime or something.
Yeah,
in
1908, Police Commissioner Theodore Bingham, who I mentioned, Arthur Woods. Woods is really trying to steer a different path than Bingham, who is this really like crusty conservative figure in the New York police. He writes this article that half the criminals in New York are either Jewish or Italian, and he says the Jews are going to be pickpockets and thieves in New York because the men have trouble manually working. They can't find work in America because of their physical attributes, so they steal from people. And this elicits panic among Jewish charities, major Jewish political figures. Then in 1912, there's another flare-up of kind of Jewish crime, and a congressman from Georgia states specifically, we need to begin to impose a literacy test for new arrivals because look what's happening in New York. So when you have these flare-ups of nativism, that's when you see the Jewish community really become concerned about Jewish crime.
Well, we have another question in the Q&A, and that's from Dory Sanders, who asks, do you see correlations between the sociology of this Jewish dynamic and present day issues with immigrants today? So the question is about, the
answer is yes. I mean, immigrants do the labor in America that Americans don't want to do. And that opens up immigrant life to all sorts of exploitation being taken advantage of. The current political moment of a large population of undocumented immigrants in America who are very vulnerable to all sorts of illegal machinations and exploitation. The story is different. There were different immigration laws in America. The American economy looked different, but I think there are many parallels with the experience of immigrants today and what these Jewish immigrants went through. Again, you have to look at the dynamics of the flows of people into the country, what industries they work in. But I think there are a lot of, useful comparative analyses you can make between, Jewish immigration, Italian immigration, Greek immigration to America, and then certainly later migrations to the United States as well. Chinese immigration during this period as well offers really useful comparisons as well.
So I have other two questions. Where is the, can you say something about the people who defended the Jewish criminals in the legal system? Do you have a particular person? I think you mentioned one in one of the slides, and that's Hillquit. So can you say something about the legal defense? And then I would like to go back to a question that Stanley posed, which I don't think we really got enough information. What happens on Shabbat for these people? Do they observe Shabbat at all? Is there any kind of religious or not just cultural, but religious commitment among those people? I mean, what do we know about their kind of spiritual, shall we say, lifestyle, if there is one?
Yeah, so I'll do the second question first. We know that there were some religious gangsters. They wouldn't do certain things on Shabbat. They went to synagogue. They gave money to the local shul and stuff. I think this gets back to the question posed before, like what's culturally Jewish about these. In the grand jury notes on Dopey Benny, he says the first time he got arrested, quote, he got in trouble at the synagogue. Like what? I don't know what happened. What does that mean? This was a period of American Jewish history where Jews were a kind of identifiable ethnic population in the United States. Sometimes that manifested in religious ways, going to synagogue, wearing religious clothing. Other times it was other cultural, elements of secular Jewish culture, speaking Yiddish. The gangsters, some of them seem to be religious. I think it's safe to say most of them were not. But I don't think that means that they weren't part of this, Jewish cultural world of the Lower East Side. And not that you're suggesting that, but yeah, it's hard to tell their religious convictions. It does seem when they went to prison, Sing Sing had a longtime rabbi, Jewish chaplain, Rabbi Goldstein. I forgot his first name, Jacob Goldstein, I believe. And we know that some of these criminals would confide in him and maybe become more spiritual in prison, but they were very much part of the Jewish cultural Yiddish speaking milieu of that period. Your first question was about
who defends them, who's doing the legal work on their behalf, if there is one.
One thing I found interesting in this is a lot of these gangsters, once they ally with the ILGWU, which becomes a powerful institution after the Protocols of Peace, they get pretty good legal representation. Sometimes some of the top law firms, Joseph Baron Dess, for example, was represented by Howe and Hummel, which was one of the most prominent defense firms in New York City. Often some of these defense firms had connections with Tammany Hall, so they also had connections to the judges. That was often sort of an angle. I encountered one lawyer named Louis Tulk, who definitely had some untoward relationship with a judge he was getting criminals released on bail very easily. But by the mid 1910s, they actually get pretty good legal representation. And you also have a growing class of Jewish immigrants who are getting law degrees, people like Meyer London, Morris Hillquit, who now have the legal competence to defend these unions too by the 1910s. That's another part of this story.
Yeah, and Morris Hillquit was a socialist, right?
Yes, he was. And so just to be clear, he didn't defend Dopey Benny. Dopey Benny actually never goes to trial for the trial of the 7 cloakmakers. He basically serves as like a key witness. He's never actually brought into the trial, but his testimony gets the ball rolling. Morris Sigmund, it's unclear how much the rank and file of the ILGWU knew he was allying with Dopey Benny, but Morris Hillquit seemed to have no issue representing these union officials. And in his autobiography, he indicates he didn't think they were involved in criminal activity, or he doesn't really mention it. So I don't think he saw this as defending kind of criminal unions.
Mm-hmm. But fair to say, no racketeering on Shabbos. So I think we have time for one final question.
Let me also just say about that. The factories ran Friday night and Saturday.
Huh.
So, like we're talking about, did the gangsters, the business people didn't always follow, these, they would often offer, you could work on Sunday, but the factories were also running. So I don't know how much they were following the religious cycle.
Yeah.
So much.
Surely the kosher chicken butchers would have had to close on Saturday.
That, yes, that's a safer assumption. Yeah. And the bakers unions and so on. Yeah.
Mhm. So I think we have time for one final question, and it's a perfect question from Andrea, who wants to know more about your book that's coming out.
I'm working on it, working hard. I'm hoping to wrap it up by this summer. I'm done with all the research, really. It's a matter of just finishing the chapters. So please stay tuned. The book will be available soon.
So in the time that remains, so you mentioned Jenna Josselit's wonderful book on this topic, and I think Michael Alexander also dealt with this in his Jazz Age Jews. Am I right?
Yeah, Michael. Yeah, he does. Sorry.
My question is, if you have some other bibliographic references, you can tell us this by mouth, and then we can share your bibliography later.
Yeah, absolutely. One really good book is by a historian named Andrew Wender Cohen, who wrote this book, The Racketeer's Progress. It's not specifically about Jewish history, but it's about the development of racketeering as a means of defending craft traditions in different unions. And this idea was really useful for me, thinking about how gangsters are trying to defend a kind of the unions, different craft positions, but also kind of ethnic community from being exploited economically. So Racketeer's Progress is very good. There's also a great, an earlier large look at American Jewish crime by Albert Fried, The Rise and Fall of the American Jewish Gangsters, worth checking out. And then there's a lot of good fiction from Jews from this time period. Michael Gold's Jews Without Money is a great example. Hunch, Punch, and Jowl by Samuel Orlick. Some of that stuff is very good. I'm actually currently reading Isaac Bashevis Singer's Scum, which looks at prostitution, and he mentions the pimp pogrom. So, when you're looking through Yiddish and Jewish literature, these characters pop up. They do.
Well, before I actually have one more question for you, but Shoshana Tenzer actually congratulates you for this lecture. This is so enlightening and really interesting kind of social history that otherwise we don't normally talk about it or think about it. So it's very, very useful.
Oh,
but can you say something about the challenges that your work has encountered, especially in the archives? What was most difficult for you? Finding the documents or identifying the people, or what, doing the analysis? What was hardest?
Yeah, that's a great question. Tracking down some of these documents is difficult. I think a lot of people who work in this type of history do similar stuff. I think figuring out what's true is difficult in these documents. A gangster will say something even in a grand jury minutes, and you have to follow up with that. Is that true? Did that strike actually happen? Did this union boss actually pay this person? That was difficult, and some of the crime reports are also, some of them seem fantastical, so you have to kind of do more. Press accounts that I don't want to get too in this. Press accounts from the time period were, I'll just say, sensational and bordering on the false about some of these. Some of them said, Dopey Benny had torture chambers where he was torturing workers. No, none of that stuff happened. But, if you're just kind of scratching the surface of these documents, you might think it's true. So learning about crime in a period of nativism and sensationalism, it's difficult because you have to balance sources and find out what's true. And, also the burden of not portraying Jews as a criminal population in America, because they were not. And very much part of the story is the Jewish, resistance to having illegality be such a major part of the industrial economy. So those were some of the challenges in this project.
But you're also rewriting, or you're trying to enrich what we know about the labor movement, right? So
Precisely,
to a great extent, you're a labor historian, not just historian of illegal activities.
Right. Yeah, and I think this is really kind of fundamentally like a labor history about how people worked in America and the conditions under which they worked and how they try to create better working conditions for themselves. And it's messy.
Great. Yeah, that's a fascinating research. So we are going to thank Dr. Welt for a very interesting and fascinating, really intriguing lecture that will lead to more studies by him and by others. And I'm going to say to all of you, not only good night wherever you are, but also happy Hanukkah, because that's coming up in about a week. So we will see many of you again next semester. We also have a very rich program. I'm not going to tell you all the activities because I don't remember all of them myself, but we will have another conference on of JSMG, that's Jewish Science and Medicine Group. We will have individual lectures. We have quite a lot waiting for us in the coming semester. So have a wonderful winter break, so to speak, as our students are going to have a break, and we will see you all after January. All
Thank
right,
you.
good night and thank you.
Yep.
Great, Aaron. This was
Thank you.
really rich. This is
Stanley, turn off the recording.
the recording.
Thank you, Lisa. We still needed you.